Hello and welcome to the Ramblings of a 42-year-old man. We are going to jump back into our Final Fantasy series today. Continuing along what would be considered our mainline series, but we're going to be a little bit divergent. So we just finished up Final Fantasy X last week, and the next numbered Final Fantasy game is Final Fantasy XI. Now, the thing with that is Final Fantasy XI is a online multiplayer game. So versus everything we've had from 1 through 10, which has all been single-playered, turn-based RPG kind of games, this one goes on a whole other level, kind of trying to compete at the time with like the World of Warcrafts and the things such as that. And as such, I'm going to kind of lump this one in with Square and Final Fantasy's second attempt to do an online game, that is Final Fantasy XIV. So today's video is going to cover Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XIV. We're going to talk about the online multiplayer Final Fantasy games in this video. So we'll talk first about 11, give a little background about that. I'm really not going to get into story mode with either of these. They are online games and your stories can vary. There is a main plot that overarches everything, but again, most of the stories you are doing a bunch of side quests and meeting people and grouping together in parties and stuff like that. And honestly, I have not played either of them, so I would not have a whole lot to offer in the way of the story of the games. So we'll just kind of do some development stuff, some of the gameplay options, and then the positives and negatives of each of the games as we go forward. So with that, we will begin first with Final Fantasy XI, and then after we speak about that a little bit, we'll jump on to Final Fantasy XIV. So please stay tuned. All right, so Final Fantasy XI was released in 2002. So Final Fantasy X had just come out a year before. So this was released in 2002. It was also on PlayStation 2, just like Final Fantasy X was. Also released on PC, being that as a multiplayer online game. PC was definitely a way to go for it. A lot of the PlayStation 2s of this era did not come with hard drives. So really, you could have a PlayStation 2 version of this game, but you wouldn't be able to play it if you were not connected to the internet. At the time, PS3 was kind of the first time you had a built-in internet source on a PlayStation console. PlayStation 2s did not start that way. You would have to get an external hard drive and add it on there. Later versions of the PS2 would include some of that as well, but was not a standard for PlayStation 2 at the time, which made Final Fantasy XI a bit harder for a lot of people to play on PlayStation. And that's why we had the PC version where a lot of people were able to play that way. It was released later on the Xbox 360, but this was in 2006 after it had already been out for a number of years. All versions of the game, no matter which system you're playing them on, require a monthly service fee, which is a little different than a lot of multiplayer games. A lot of multiplayer games online games will kind of let you play for free, but then there's things that you have to pay for when you're in there. So it's almost like free to play, but you can't do a lot of the really intricate stuff unless you pay for it. Square did not want to go that way. Square wanted it to be purely, you pay your monthly fee and you get all the stuff in the game. You play the game. That's it. And it's worked for them. They've never changed that mode, even with Final Fantasy XIV. They both run that same way. So over the years, there's been 5 different expansions to Final Fantasy XI and 6 different additional scenarios that were added in that time. Expansions will bring like new stories, new adventures, new quests, new areas, new items, things such as that. And as crazy it may sound, considering Final Fantasy XIV was kind of the newer online game, Final Fantasy XI is still kicking. It is still out there. There are still people playing it, and we'll get into a little bit of that when we jump into the legacy of the game. But for now, we'll jump into some of the gameplay. All right, so for the gameplay aspects of Final Fantasy XI, it is quite different than what we've seen so far in Final Fantasy 1 through 10, where you have your character and they're part of this overall quest, and you have things like Tidus and Cloud and Squall and all these people that you're playing as a character, but you're not actually creating them yourself. It's a standard put together character. Well, being that this is multiplayer online, you build your avatar when you start the game. So you're building your character. You got a choice of different races, a choice of different genders. Obviously, you got a choice of different. You can kind of customize the facial features and stuff. Think of the way of an Elder Scroll game starting. Anybody who's played Skyrim, you create your character at the beginning. This is similar to that vibe. You got 5 races to choose from. You can be male or female. You can change body, hairstyles. There's certain jobs you can choose from, and there's alliances that you choose from as well. Depending on the jobs and the alliances you choose is where you will start off in this game. Now, there are no random battles, as we've seen so far in all the Final Fantasy games up to this point. This is the beginning of the kind of the end of that. From this point on, all the mainline Final Fantasy series, there is no more just random battles anymore. So the way that it works in this way is you're running around on this 3D world. Enemies are running around on the world too. You get close enough to them, attacks engage. And so the battles just kind of occur in real time, and you know, you can run off away from enemies too, but they will tend to follow you for a certain distance as well. Then, like I said, this would continue. Final Fantasy XII would use a very similar system. Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy XV, all of that kind of stayed the same way. So you have in this game missions and you have quests. So missions are kind of your main storyline points of the game. You complete missions to kind of progress through the main overarching story of this online game. And then quests are your side missions. And you're going to see there's a lot more quests available than missions because, you know, like all online games, the fun of it really is just playing. And yeah, you can go, like, think of like Skyrim. You can go complete the main part of Skyrim, but you still have hours of all sorts of other stuff to do. It's a very similar vibe. Those quests will give you rewards and, you know, gold and experience and items, but they don't necessarily advance the main storyline quest. With this, there's very little focus in Final Fantasy XI on player versus player. A lot of online games are about, you know, you think your Call of Duties, your Fortnites, they're people versus each other, shooting each other, you know. This was more about players versus the environment. You know, you're playing like a Final Fantasy game where you got enemies and you're running around and stuff. So instead of fighting each other, you want to make groups. You want to create parties. You want to kind of, you know, coexist with your other players. You're working together to try to do a lot of the different storylines and quests and stuff like that. And you can make a party of up to 4 people at a time. Actually, I'm sorry, up to 6 people. In Final Fantasy XI, you go up to 6 people at a time. And then you can do what's called alliances. And that would be, you can go up to 3 different parties of 6 people. So you can have an overall alliance of 18 people. If you've got 18 friends out there playing Final Fantasy XI online, come together, 18 people, you can go do some pretty big quests that way. So it was definitely a game about community, really. So the job system of this, there's 22 different jobs that you can choose from. Now, you have to reach level 30 in one of 6 standard jobs before you can open up any of the other options. So you kind of start with one of those 6, you work up there. Once you hit level 30, you got a lot more options to jump into as well. So that kind of covers gameplay, and we're going to do a little bit of legacy of Final Fantasy XI before we move on to 14. So legacy of Final Fantasy XI, as I mentioned, it is still playable out there. Now, it's not playable on every system anymore. 2015 was the last released new scenario. It's called Rhapsodies of Vana'diel. Vana'diel is the land that you're playing through. And it was the final edition back in 2015 was added. The PS2 version, the Xbox 360 version, the support for those ended back in 2016. So you can no longer play this on a PS2 or a 360, which, you know, we're up to PS5 and Xbox S and all these different, you know, upgrades since then. And we also have new Final Fantasy Online game, number 14, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But PC, you can still play Final Fantasy XI on PC. And there was some talk about maybe it was going to be ending back in 2020. Some rumors went around, but it did not happen. It is still going as of today. And so if you're somebody who started Final Fantasy XI and really enjoyed it and played it for the last 20 years, you still can. So that's Final Fantasy XI, and that jumps us. So we will hop over Final Fantasy XIII, which we'll talk about on a future ramble, because that's going back to a single-player RPG game. But I want to go ahead and continue our talk about the online games, and we will jump over to Final Fantasy XIV next. All right, so with the success of Final Fantasy XI, but then the generation upgrade to the PlayStation 3, they wanted to create a new online game for the PlayStation 3. What happened is they created Final Fantasy XIV, released it out on PC first with the plan of releasing on PS3 later, but the issues with that game were so vast and so myriad and so many customer complaints about it that they never even got a chance to put it on PS3. The interface was horrible. The gameplay was all cited as complaints from people that played it. The critical and fan response was just really, really, really negative. So they shut down that version by 2012. There was no more of that original Final Fantasy XIV game. So they relaunched it a year later in Final Fantasy 13 as Final Fantasy. I'm sorry, in Final Fantasy 13 in 2013 as Final Fantasy 14: A Realm Reborn. Now the Realm Reborn was released on PS3, was released on PC, and it had many future releases as well. PS4 had a version come out in 2014. PS5 got a version back in 2021. The PS3 version was eventually shut down in 2017 as it was upgraded to these future consoles. There's been 4 major expansions to date of this one, because once Realm Reborn came out, a lot of the issues they had with that original game were taken care of, and it has been massively successful ever since that point. So let's get into a little bit of the gameplay aspects of it, and then we'll talk about kind of where Final Fantasy XIV is nowadays. So gameplay-wise, it's very, very similar to the way the Final Fantasy XI was. As we talked about Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy XIII, we'll see a lot of this too. That big open world, you're running around, enemies are running around, you get close to each other, and battles ensue. But there's no random battles anymore. Your quests are usually little shorter tasks that will earn you experience points and items and things like that. And your main scenario quests are a little bit longer, and they will advance the overarching plot of the game as you go forward. Still mostly player versus environment, but there are some more options for player versus player. That's one of the complaints about Final Fantasy XI. There wasn't enough player versus player content, which they really weren't trying to do that. It really was supposed to feel like you're playing a Final Fantasy game, not like you're playing Call of Duty. But they did do a couple options. There's like an arena option where you can combat each other, and there's some other specific areas that you go into that will be player versus player. And it tells you before you get into there, it's like, hey, you're about to go into a player versus player zone. Do you want to do this? Because a lot of people just want to play Final Fantasy. They just want to have a good time, not necessarily battle each other. So in this one, parties can be built up to 4 characters, and that's for like dungeon exploration and stuff like that. And if you're going after a specific boss battle, you can actually make a party of up to 8 characters. Again, you're not necessarily doing this with random NPCs like you would be in a Final Fantasy mainline game, but these online games, you're doing it with other players around the world, so you can come together with friends, or you can actually post like, hey, I want to go do this dungeon, does anybody else want to join my party? And people from wherever can join, and you can go play it. You're going to want to try to make a party of varied abilities and jobs, because you have everybody is just tank hitters, but you don't have any sort of magic, or you don't have any sort of healing, things like that. It's not going to go well for you. So you got to kind of make sure that you have some differences in your abilities to be able to get through these dungeons. Most of these dungeons are built, and the boss battles especially are built where you'll have to have variety in the party. You can't just all have the same kind of character. So yeah, again, I'm not going to get into the story mode of this game. The story mode of 14 is vast. There's been multiple expansions over the years, and every expansion adds new parts of the main story and new side quests and everything like that. But it is, like I said, very successful, and it is still going on now, which we'll talk about a little bit when we get into the legacy of Final Fantasy XIV. All right, so that 2013 re-release of Final Fantasy XIV really blew up. It was tons of positive reviews, critically, financially successful. It is actually Square Enix's biggest, most profitable game. So while more copies of Final Fantasy VII may have been sold from now, Final Fantasy XIV is the most profitable, because not only are you getting money from the sale of the game, you are getting money every single month for the people who are playing, because they are still doing that monthly subscription fee. So again, very successful. Tons of people are playing it. New expansions keep coming out for it. There was one as recently as, I think, 2021. I think it was the Stormbreaker one, or Shadowbreaker came out. And it's still strongly supported. They have not, obviously they just had a PS5 version come out, which is the newest PlayStation system. So it is very much supported still. You can play it on PC anytime you want to. And it is one of the largest subscription-based multiplayer online games that there is. So successful still going on, even though we're, our mainline series we're up to, Final Fantasy 16 is coming out this year, but Final Fantasy 11 and 14 are both still continuing in their online forms. So that gets us through kind of the Final Fantasy online games, the 11 and 14. We have Final Fantasy 12 coming up, then we got 13 and 15 that we'll talk through, and then eventually Final Fantasy 16 will come out. We'll do a couple little side rambles into some of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII games that they released, which included some side games around the world of Final Fantasy VII. And then also Final Fantasy VII, we will probably spend a week talking about the kind of the remake, Final Fantasy VII Remake, which also includes a remake of a game called Crisis Core that was around Final Fantasy VII, that we'll talk about the original version of that when we get in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. And then there's going to be a sequel to the Final Fantasy VII Remake called Final Fantasy Rebirth, planned for end of this year, early next year. We'll see how that goes with release dates. Those release dates are always very fluid when it comes to these games. But before we get to those games, we will have Final Fantasy 16 sometime this summer. It is still planned for June. It's coming up pretty soon, so I'll be excited to kind of play through that. It'll be a while till I'll be able to talk about it, because I'm sure it's going to be a big game that I want to play before I have much to say. But that's where we are when it comes to Final Fantasy, and we will just kind of continue rolling one out weekly until we get to Final Fantasy 16, and we'll see how that goes. So thank you for listening to me ramble. We'll talk again soon. Thank you very much.